The morning my daughter Wren slid a glossy brochure for Whispering Pines Assisted. Living across my kitchen counter was the day I decided to finally reveal everything. Her brother Finley stood beside her, arms crossed, with that familiar look of patronizing concern they'd perfected over the last few years. "Mom, we've talked about this," Wren said, her manicured finger tapping on the brochure. "This place has everything you need: activities, medical care, and people to look after. You'd never have to worry about managing this big house alone anymore." Finley nodded in agreement. "They even have gardening clubs," he added, as if that small detail would somehow sweeten what they were really suggesting, that at 63, I was no longer capable of caring for myself. "Before I jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I poured myself another cup of coffee, hiding my smile behind the steam. If they only knew that the gardening I'd been doing in the renovated barn at the back of my property for the past 6 years was now generating more monthly income than both their salaries combined. I met their concerned gazes across my farmhouse kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd once packed their school lunches, nursed their childhood fevers, and later dried my tears after their father Roland walked out for his 20-something receptionist. It was also the kitchen where, 6 years ago at age 57, I'd opened my laptop and registered my business, Meadowlark Botanicals. "I know you both care about me," I said, pushing the brochure back toward them. "But I think there's something you should see first." I stood up, smoothing down my gardening apron. "Follow me." Their exchange of glances wasn't lost on me. That silent communication between siblings that screamed, "Mom's being difficult again." But they followed me anyway, through the back door and across the property toward the old barn that Roland had always planned to renovate but never did. After he left, I'd used part of the divorce settlement to transform it instead. "Mom, we don't need to see your herb garden again." Wren sighed behind me. "We know you enjoy your little hobby, but that's not the point. The point is," I pushed open the heavy wooden doors, revealing not the small herb operation they'd seen during their infrequent visits, but a state-of-the-art botanical processing facility. Stainless steel distillation equipment gleamed under industrial lighting. 5 employees in white lab coats looked up from their workstations, nodding respectfully before returning to their tasks. The air was fragrant with lavender, rosemary, and mint, the signature scent of my best-selling organic skincare line. "Welcome to Meadowlark Botanicals," I said, turning to catch their stunned expressions. "My little hobby that now supplies organic essential oils to luxury spas across 3 continents and generates annual revenue of just over $4 million. The silence was deafening. Finley's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Wren's perfectly sculpted eyebrows disappeared beneath her bangs. But you said you were just growing herbs for farmers' markets," Finley finally stammered. "I was, 6 years ago." I walked them through the facility, explaining each process, introducing my team, biochemists and botanists who specialized in organic extraction methods. I showed them the packaging area where our signature blue glass bottles were filled, labeled, and prepared for shipping to high-end retailers and directly to consumers through our e-commerce platform. Last month, Radiance Luxury Hotels approached us about creating an exclusive line for their international properties, I continued, ignoring their ongoing shock. "The contract alone is worth 7 figures. I've been considering whether to accept or focus on our direct-to-consumer growth." We ended in my office, a bright corner room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking my extensive botanical gardens. On the walls hung framed features from Vogue, Elle, and Forbes. On my desk sat an industry award for sustainability in beauty products. "Why didn't you tell us?" Wren asked, her voice small and confused. The authority she'd walked in with had evaporated. I settled into my chair, gesturing for them to sit across from me. Would you have believed me? Or would you have worried I was being impractical, wasting my limited resources on a foolish dream? The question hung between us, answering itself in their guilty expressions. The truth was, I'd tried to tell them at the beginning. When Roland left after 30 years of marriage, I'd been devastated but also strangely liberated. Our relationship had been comfortable but stifling. He was the businessman. I was the supportive wife who'd set aside her botany degree to raise his children and host his corporate dinners. After the divorce, I'd called Wren excitedly about my plans to use my settlement to start a small botanical business. "Mom, be sensible," she'd cautioned over the phone. "You need that money for retirement. Maybe take a gardening class at the community center instead." Finley had been even more blunt. "Dad always said you were terrible with money. This is exactly what he meant." So I stopped sharing my plans. I quietly registered my business, converted the barn, and planted my first commercial crop of lavender, rosemary, and chamomile. I took online courses in business management and digital marketing. I worked 18-hour days, often falling asleep at my computer, learning through trial and error. The first year was brutal. I nearly went bankrupt twice. I developed arthritis in my hands from the constant harvesting and processing. But something remarkable happened along the way. I discovered I had a talent for business that had gone untapped during my decades as Roland's wife. My scientific background gave me an edge in developing formulations that actually worked, not just smelled nice. And without Roland's constant reminders of my limitations, I flourished. By year 3, I'd hired my first employees. By year 4, we'd landed our first major retail account. Now, in year 6, I was fielding acquisition offers from international conglomerates. And through it all, I'd maintained the fiction that I was just a divorced woman with a small herb garden because it was easier than fighting their perception of me as someone who needed their guidance and protection. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "So you've been wealthy this whole time?" Finley asked, his eyes fixed on the financial projections visible on my computer screen. "While we've been worrying about you living on a fixed income?" "I've been building something," I corrected gently. "The wealth is recent, and frankly, secondary to the satisfaction of creating something meaningful. Something mine." "But why keep it secret from us?" Wren pressed, her voice tinged with hurt. I took a deep breath. This was the harder part. "Because you never believed I could do it. From the moment your father left, you both slipped into his role of managing me, protecting me from myself. You meant well, but you never saw me. Nora Caldwell, the woman. Only your mother who suddenly needed guidance without your father's direction." They started to protest, but I held up my hand. "It's all right, I understand. But I needed to prove to myself that I could succeed without anyone's approval or permission, that the voice in my head telling me I was capable, the voice that had been nearly silenced during my marriage, was right." Finley stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back to us. I recognized the stance, identical to Roland's, when he felt challenged. "So this whole meeting today, the assisted living brochure, you let us come here and make fools of ourselves when you knew." "I did," I acknowledged. "I'd planned to show you eventually, but your concern about my ability to care for myself seemed like the right moment. I'm sorry if that feels manipulative." Wren remained seated, studying me with new eyes. "You've changed, Mom," she said finally. "You're different." "I've become myself," I replied simply. We sat in silence for a moment, the gentle hum of the processing equipment in the background. Finally, Finley turned around. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Now? Now I continue growing my business. I'm expanding into medicinal botanicals next year, returning to my original passion before I detoured into being Roland Caldwell's wife. And you two can stop worrying about me ending up destitute." And the house? Wren asked, referring to their earlier concerns. I'm keeping it, though I am renovating the east wing into a research laboratory. I smiled, softening the moment. You're both always welcome here, but as visitors to my home, not as caretakers. The weeks following that revelation were awkward. Finley threw himself into researching the botanical industry, sending me articles I'd read years ago. Wren vacillated between pride and something like competitive resentment that I'd succeeded in business where she was still climbing the corporate ladder. Neither quite knew how to relate to this new version of their mother. Roland called when he inevitably heard the news through mutual friends. Nora, he began without preamble when I answered. I always knew you had it in you. The familiar attempt to retroactively position himself as my champion. No, Roland, I replied calmly. You didn't. But that's okay. Neither did I. 6 months later, I was featured on the cover of Business Innovators magazine. Late bloomer. How Nora Caldwell built a multi-million-dollar botanical empire after. The photographer captured me in my gardens at sunrise, surrounded by the lavender that had started it all. Wren framed the cover and hung it in her office. Finley sent it to Roland without comment. The article mentioned my beginnings, my divorce, and my late-in-life entrepreneurship. But it didn't capture the profound personal transformation that had accompanied my business success. It couldn't convey how reclaiming my passion had healed decades of diminishment, or how proving my capability to myself had mattered more than proving it to anyone else. The most satisfying moment came not when I deposited my first $1 million check, but the day I realized I no longer heard Roland's voice in my head questioning my decisions. It had been replaced by my own voice, confident, clear, and unapologetic. As for Wren and Finley, our relationship has evolved. There are still moments when they slip into old patterns, offering unsolicited advice about my business or personal life. But these instances are now met with my gentle amusement rather than silent acquiescence. They're learning to see me as a whole person separate from my role as their mother, a woman with ambitions, talents, and yes, flaws of her own. Last month, Wren called me for advice about starting her own consultancy. I've been thinking about it for years, she confessed, but I was afraid of failing. The fear never goes away, I told her honestly. You just learn to let it ride in the back seat instead of driving. Finley has shown interest in the business itself, particularly our sustainability practices. While I'm not ready to bring family into Meadowlark, his environmental engineering background could prove valuable as we expand. The assisted living brochure that sparked our confrontation sits in my desk drawer as a reminder. Not of my children's well-intentioned but misguided concern, but of how easily we accept others' definitions of our capabilities when we should be defining them ourselves. The journey from Roland's wife to founder and CEO hasn't been easy. There were nights I cried myself to sleep from exhaustion and doubt. Mornings I could barely straighten my arthritic fingers to begin the day's work. Moments I nearly gave up. But the woman who emerged on the other side of that struggle is someone I'm proud to be. Someone who reminds me daily that our most significant blooming can happen at any age, once we give ourselves permission to grow. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Roland had never left, if I'd never been forced out of the comfortable numbness of my marriage. Would Meadowlark Botanicals exist? Would I have discovered my untapped abilities? Or would I have continued moving through, life half awake, my potential dormant beneath decades of compromise? I can't know for certain, but standing in my gardens at dawn, watching the first light illuminate the lavender, rosemary, and chamomile that transformed my life, I feel only gratitude for the path that led me here, every painful, beautiful, difficult step of it. And when my children visit now, they walk these same gardens not with concern for my welfare, but with respect for what I've built. Sometimes, as we share a glass of wine on the porch at sunset, I catch them looking at me with curious eyes, as if seeing me for the first time. not as someone to be managed, but as someone to be discovered. It's never too late to become who you might have been. I'm living proof of that. And in the discovery of my own capabilities, I've given my children an unexpected gift: the chance to know their mother not just as a parent, but as a woman who refused to be diminished by circumstances or defined by limitations others placed upon her. That revelation, more than any business success, may be my most meaningful legacy. The path that led me to that moment in my botanical empire wasn't straightforward. Few people realize that before becoming Nora Caldwell, entrepreneur and founder of Meadowlark Botanicals, I was Nora Ellison, the shy daughter of a small-town pharmacist. Growing up in Cedarbrook, my father's shop was my second classroom. While other girls played with dolls, I was measuring compounds and learning about the healing properties of plants. My father, with his wire-rimmed glasses perpetually sliding, down his nose would whisper, "Pay attention, Nora. Nature provides every cure we need. We just have to listen carefully." Those early lessons in botanical medicine formed the foundation of my passion, leading me to pursue a degree in botany and pharmaceutical science. My thesis on traditional herbal remedies and their potential applications in modern medicine earned recognition from several pharmaceutical companies. At 23, my future seemed limitless. I had offers from research institutions and was considering a doctoral program. Then I met Roland Caldwell at a university fundraiser. Tall, confident, with piercing blue eyes and a charismatic laugh that commanded attention in any room. He was already making waves in commercial real estate development. When he focused his attention on me, the serious, bookish researcher, I was unprepared for the intensity of feeling that followed. "You understand plants better than people," he teased on our third date, as I enthusiastically explained a breakthrough in my research. "It's charming." That word, charming, should have been my first warning. My passion wasn't valued for its substance but tolerated as an endearing quirk. But I was too enamored to notice. We married 6 months later. I still remember my father's expression at our wedding, pride mixed with concern. "Don't lose yourself, Nora," he whispered as he gave me away. "You have too much to offer the world." But losing myself happened gradually, like erosion reshaping a coastline. First came the subtle suggestions that my research schedule was incompatible with supporting Roland's career. Then the not-so-subtle remarks about the importance of being present at business dinners with his clients. When I became pregnant with Finley just a year into our marriage, the decision seemed already made for me. I took a temporary leave from my research position. Temporary stretched into permanent. Finley was followed by Wren 2 years later. Roland's business expanded rapidly, requiring more networking, more entertaining, more of my time managing our growing domestic responsibilities. My botany books gathered dust on shelves, eventually migrating to boxes in the attic during one of our moves to progressively larger homes as Roland's success grew. "You're so lucky," Roland's colleagues' wives would tell me at dinner parties. "Most women would kill for this life." And materially speaking, they weren't wrong. Our Georgian colonial in Valmont Heights sat on 3 pristine acres. We had household help, luxury vehicles, vacations in exclusive resorts. The children attended elite private schools. But something essential had been surgically removed from my life: purpose beyond supporting others. I tried, occasionally, to reclaim pieces of my former passion. When the children started elementary school, I converted a small corner of our expansive property into an herb garden. Roland indulged this hobby with benevolent amusement. "Nora needs her little plants," he'd tell guests, with the same tone one might use to describe a child's attachment to a security blanket. "It keeps her busy." The garden became my sanctuary, the one place where I still felt connected to my truest self. I experimented with different varieties, studied cultivation techniques, and began making small-batch tinctures and salves using my father's old formulas. When he passed away during Wren's junior year of high school, I inherited his collection of botanical reference books and handwritten recipes dating back generations. "What are you going to do with all these dusty old books?" Roland asked as I carefully unpacked them in our home library. "Your father's remedies are charming antiques, but we have real medicine now." His dismissive laugh still echoes in my memory. But I kept the books, reading them late at night after everyone was asleep. Sometimes I'd cry silently over the yellowed pages, mourning not just my father, but the version of myself that had once had ambitions beyond being Roland Caldwell's perfectly curated wife. The children grew, absorbed their father's worldview by osmosis. Finley, following Roland's footsteps, went into commercial development with an environmental engineering background that made his projects more marketable. Wren pursued corporate law, specializing in mergers and acquisitions. Both viewed my interest in botany as an eccentric hobby, something to be tolerated but not taken seriously. "Mom's plants," they'd say with affectionate condescension when they came home for holidays. "At least it keeps her busy." The echo of their father's dismissal passed down like an heirloom. By our 30th anniversary, Roland and I had perfected the choreography of our marriage, a dance of comfortable distance, predictable rhythms, and unspoken compromises. I had become exactly what he needed: socially adept, emotionally supportive, intellectually unthreatening. My world had contracted to fit within the boundaries he'd established. Or so I thought. The day everything changed was ordinary in every respect. I was planning a dinner party for Roland's newest clients, reviewing the caterer's menu in my home office when his text message arrived. "Need to talk. Coming home early." No punctuation, no terms of endearment. Just information, efficiently. Delivered. I remember checking my appearance before he arrived, a habit ingrained over decades. Hair neatly styled, makeup refreshed, clothing unwrinkled. Roland valued presentation above all else. He entered my office without knocking, his expression unreadable. "Nora," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I've decided to make some changes." The clinical detachment in his voice told me everything before he spoke another word. Roland had always approached emotional matters like business transactions, assessing value, calculating costs, maximizing return on investment. "I've been seeing someone," he continued, his tone suggesting he was discussing a stock purchase rather than infidelity. "Allegra understands the direction my life is taking now. We connect on a deeper level." Allegra, his firm's new marketing director, 36 years old to my 57. I'd met her at the company holiday party, noticed how she laughed at Roland's jokes with just the right amount of admiration. "I'll be fair in the settlement," he added, already transitioning to logistics. "You can keep this house if you want, though it's really too large for one person. I've already spoken with my attorney about the financial arrangements." The remarkable thing was what I didn't feel: surprise, devastation, or even anger. Instead, sitting across from the man who had shaped my existence for 3 decades, I felt something unexpected breaking through the numbness. Relief. "How long?" I asked, my voice steadier than it had any right to be. "Does it matter?" Roland countered, checking his watch subtly, always mindful of his schedule. "No," I realized aloud. "I suppose it doesn't." He left for a conference that evening, moving his belongings to Allegra's downtown loft upon his return. The divorce proceedings were efficient, like everything Roland orchestrated. He was, as promised, financially generous, securing his image as the magnanimous ex-husband rather than the middle-aged cliché he had become. Wren and Finley were initially shocked, then pragmatically accepted the new reality. "Dad says she makes him feel alive again," Finley explained uncomfortably during one of our awkward post-divorce dinners. "He says he was stagnating." The implication hung unspoken between us, that life with me had been stifling his potential, that I was somehow insufficient. I nodded and changed the subject, not yet ready to challenge the narrative Roland was crafting about our marriage. The first months alone in our, now my house, were strangely peaceful. I wandered through rooms that had always been decorated to Roland's taste, seeing them with new eyes. I moved furniture, replaced artwork, donated his remaining possessions to charity. Each change, however small, felt like reclaiming territory. The pity in my children's eyes when they visited was harder to bear than the divorce itself. They'd inherited their father's fundamental misunderstanding of who I was, seeing me as dependent, fragile, incapable of thriving without Roland's guidance. Their concern, while genuine, was predicated on a version of me that had never truly existed. "Mom, have you thought about selling this place?" Wren suggested during one visit, eyeing the expansive property. "It's a lot for you to manage alone." "I'm managing fine," I replied, noticing how she exchanged glances with her brother, the same look Roland would give the children when I said something he considered naively optimistic. It was during these early days of unexpected freedom that I began to spend more time in my gardens. What had been a modest herb patch expanded as I reclaimed flower beds once dedicated to Roland's preferred ornamental displays. I planted lavender, chamomile, calendula, and dozens of other medicinal herbs. My hands, soft from decades of minimal, physical labor, grew calloused and strong. 6 months after Roland left, I received an unexpected visitor. Eliza Thornfield, my former research partner from university days, had come across my name while visiting her daughter in Valmont Heights. "Nora Ellison," she exclaimed when I opened the door, using my maiden name as if the intervening decades had never happened. "I've thought about you so many times over the years. Whatever happened to that brilliant research you were doing on traditional botanical formulations?" We sat in my garden for hours that afternoon, the years melting away as we fell back into the easy rhythms of scientific discussion. Eliza had gone on to found a research institute dedicated to integrating traditional plant medicine with contemporary healthcare approaches. "The field has evolved enormously," she explained, examining my herb garden with professional interest. "There's significant demand for evidence-based natural products now. The market for botanical pharmaceuticals and wellness products has exploded." As the sun set, casting long shadows across my expanding garden, Eliza made an offer that would change everything. "I'm supervising a research project on sustainable botanical production methods. We're looking for cultivation partners, people with both the knowledge and the land to grow specific medicinal varieties under controlled conditions. Would you be interested?" That night, after Eliza left, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by the research materials she'd provided. The first 5-star review from a customer whose chronic eczema had improved after decades of prescription treatments had failed. The first month, the business account showed a modest profit rather than a loss. Through it all, I told no one in my family about the true scope of what I was building. When Wren or Finley visited, they saw only what I chose to show them: a small herb garden that had expanded somewhat, a modest table at the local farmer's market selling homemade balms and tinctures. If they noticed my increasing absences from family gatherings due to gardening commitments, they attributed it to an eccentric widow's harmless hobby. Roland, when our paths occasionally crossed at the children's events, would ask with performative concern, "Keeping busy with your plants, Nora?" His tone suggesting gentle amusement at my quaint pastimes. I would smile and nod, saying nothing about the distribution deals I was negotiating, the clinical trials my formulations were undergoing, or the manufacturing facility taking shape on the property he had once owned. There was a peculiar freedom in being underestimated. Without the weight of others' expectations or scrutiny, I could take risks that might have seemed reckless under observation. I could fail and try again, without justifying my choices or defending my capabilities. 3 years after our divorce was finalized, Roland and Allegra held their wedding at an exclusive vineyard estate. I declined the invitation politely, citing prior commitments. Those commitments included finalizing Meadowlark's first major retail partnership, a regional chain of luxury spas that would feature our products exclusively. The business grew steadily, methodically. Unlike many startups that pursued rapid expansion at the expense of quality, I maintained tight control over production methods and ingredients. Every batch was tested for potency and purity. Suppliers were vetted not just for their organic certifications, but for sustainable farming practices. Packaging was selected for minimal environmental impact. This commitment to quality over volume meant higher price points but also higher margins and fiercely loyal customers. Word of mouth became our most effective advertising. Dermatologists began recommending our products for patients with sensitive skin. Wellness influencers featured our tinctures in their routines. Luxury hotels requested custom formulations for their spa services. By year 4, the barn had been expanded twice to accommodate growing production demands. The student workers had been replaced by full-time employees with backgrounds in biochemistry, herbalism, and sustainable agriculture. The direct-to-consumer website generated more revenue than all retail partnerships combined. And a private equity firm had made the first of what would become increasingly frequent acquisition inquiries. My personal transformation paralleled the business's growth. The woman who had once checked her appearance before Roland's arrival now spent days in work clothes with soil under her fingernails and botanical oils in her hair. My hands, once manicured for corporate dinners, were now strong and capable from working with plants and equipment. Most significantly, the tentative voice that had been silenced over decades of marriage had regained its authority when discussing formulations, business strategy, or cultivation techniques. Imara, who had graduated and joined Meadowlark full-time as marketing director, observed this evolution with characteristic directness. "You know what's weird, Ms. C? When you talk about plants or business, you're completely different than when your kids call. It's like you transform into someone else around them." Her observation was uncomfortably accurate. Around Wren and Finley, I slipped back into the role they expected. Slightly helpless, moderately capable, but ultimately dependent on their guidance. It was easier than challenging their perception of me, easier than explaining why I'd hidden my success from them. "It's complicated," I told Imara. "They mean well." "Maybe," she replied, unconvinced. "Or maybe they need to see who you really are." That opportunity came sooner than I anticipated. As Meadowlark approached its 6th anniversary, the business had reached a critical inflection point. We had outgrown our production capacity yet again. International retailers were requesting distribution rights. The research partnership with Eliza's Institute had yielded patentable extraction methods with applications beyond cosmetics. The morning Wren and Finley arrived with that glossy brochure marked the culmination of years of parallel lives, mine in plain sight, yet somehow invisible to them. Standing in my kitchen, watching their concerned expressions as they outlined their plans for my future care, I felt a strange mixture of amusement and sadness. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were so busy worrying about my ability to manage a house that they'd completely missed the thriving enterprise I'd built around them. The walk to the barn that day changed everything. Seeing their stunned expressions as they took in the reality of Meadowlark Botanicals, not a hobby, but a legitimate business with employees, equipment, and substantial revenue, was both satisfying and uncomfortable. Years of their benevolent condescension crashed against the undeniable evidence of my capabilities. "I don't understand," Finley kept repeating, examining the production floor where 2 employees were carefully measuring essential oils into precision equipment. "When did all this happen?" 6 years ago, I replied simply, "after your father left." Wren's reaction was more measured, her analytical mind quickly recalibrating. "Why keep it secret?" she asked, her expression shifting between confusion and something that might have been hurt. "We could have helped you." That question, so reasonable on its surface, revealed exactly why I'd maintained the fiction of the modest herb garden. "Could you have?" I countered gently. "Or would you have worried about the risks, cautioned me to start smaller, reminded me of my age and inexperience?" Their silence was answer enough. In the weeks that followed that revelation, our relationship entered unfamiliar territory. Wren, always the more adaptable of my children, transitioned relatively quickly from concern to curiosity. She began asking thoughtful questions about the business operations, occasionally offering insights from her legal background that proved genuinely useful. Finley struggled more with the shift in perception. During a particularly tense Sunday dinner, he abruptly asked, "Were you laughing at us this whole time? Letting us worry about you when you were becoming this?" He gestured vaguely toward the barn visible through the dining room windows. "I was never laughing at you," I answered carefully. But I needed to prove something to myself without the weight of anyone else's expectations or doubts, even well-intentioned ones. The most difficult conversation came when Wren discovered just how successful Meadowlark had become. She'd been helping review a contract for an international distribution deal when she saw the projected revenue figures. "Mom," she said slowly, looking up from the paperwork spread across my office desk. "This says the company is valued at over $12 million. I nodded, continuing to sort through sample containers for our newest product line. $12 million, she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "And you let us lecture you about managing your retirement funds? You let us worry about whether you could afford to maintain this house?" I set down the samples and met her gaze directly. "Your concern came from a genuine place, Wren. I never resented it, but it was based on assumptions about my capabilities that I needed to disprove, to myself most of all." "But we're family," she protested. "Families don't keep secrets like this." That statement, so certain yet so flawed, made me smile sadly. "Don't they? Your father kept plenty of secrets. During our marriage, you and Finley have aspects of your lives you don't share with me. Families are often built on carefully maintained illusions about one another." My relationship with Roland shifted too, once news of Meadowlark's success inevitably reached him. Through our mutual social circles, his initial disbelief gave way to a particularly grating form of retroactive support. "I always knew you had untapped potential, Nora," he declared during an unexpected visit to what had once been our shared home. He surveyed the property with new eyes, noting the expanded production facilities and manicured test gardens. "You just needed the right motivation to find it." His presumption, that my success was somehow connected to his abandonment rather than achieved despite it, might once have infuriated me. Instead, I found myself regarding him with something approaching compassion. Roland's need to position himself as the catalyst for my growth revealed more about his insecurities than my journey. "Would you like a tour of the facilities?" I offered, maintaining professional courtesy. "We've developed some interesting applications for the extraction methods we patented last year." He declined, clearly uncomfortable with this version of me, confident, knowledgeable, operating in a sphere where his opinion carried no special weight. Our conversation remained brief and superficial. As he prepared to leave, he asked with forced casualness, "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out if we'd stayed together?" The question deserved honesty. "Yes," I admitted. "Meadowlark wouldn't exist. I would never have rediscovered this part of myself while trying to fit into the space you'd allocated for me in your life." His expression tightened momentarily, before he managed a polite nod. "Well, you certainly seem fulfilled." "I am," I replied simply. It was perhaps the most genuine exchange we'd had in decades. The business continued to expand, requiring increasingly complex decisions about its future direction. International opportunities presented both promise and challenge. regulatory hurdles in foreign markets, quality control concerns with overseas, manufacturing, potential dilution of the brand's artisanal image. These questions coincided with my own reflections on personal legacy. At 63, I remained energetic and deeply engaged with Meadowlark's operations. Yet I'd begun to consider what would ultimately happen to this creation I'd built from nothing. Would it be sold to a conglomerate that might compromise its core values? Would it simply disappear when I eventually stepped back? During this period of contemplation, Imara approached me with an unexpected proposal. Now, 32 and serving as Meadowlark's chief marketing officer, she had become my most trusted colleague. "I've been thinking about Meadowlark's future," she began during one of our weekly strategy sessions. "And about how the company's ethos is so intertwined with your personal values." I nodded, having had similar thoughts myself. "What if," she continued, "we restructured as a benefit corporation? It would allow us to legally protect the company's commitment to environmental sustainability and ethical sourcing, even if ownership eventually changes." The suggestion aligned perfectly with my unvoiced concerns. We spent the next several months consulting with attorneys, revising operating agreements, and recalibrating our business model to formally incorporate social and environmental impact as legally binding performance metrics alongside profit. This transition period coincided with another significant change in my personal life. My brother Miles, always restless, had finally settled in Valmont Heights after decades of global wandering. At 67, his energy remained undiminished, though health issues had convinced him to establish a home base closer to family. Miles had always understood me in ways others didn't. During my marriage, he'd been the only one who occasionally asked, "Are you happy, Nori?" rather than assuming domestic stability equated to fulfillment. Now, as he became a more regular presence in my life, he offered perspectives that challenged my thinking in productive ways. "You've built something remarkable," he observed one evening as we shared dinner on my patio. "But I notice you still talk about it as if it's separate from you. Something you created rather than an expression of who you are." I considered his observation, rolling a stem of lavender between my fingers. Maybe because for so long, my identity was defined by my relationships to others, Roland's wife, Wren, and Finley's mother. Meadowlark feels like something I built, not something I am. Miles shook his head. "That distinction is artificial. You didn't just build a business, you reclaimed parts of yourself that had been buried. The scientific mind, the problem solver, the risk taker. Those were always you, Nori. They were just dormant for a while." His words resonated deeply, prompting me to reflect on how I presented myself to the world. For the first time in decades, I felt the familiar surge of intellectual excitement that had once defined my life. I stayed up until dawn, reading studies, examining market analyses, formulating plans. The research partnership was modest at first, dedicating 1 acre to growing specific lavender cultivars using protocols Eliza's team had developed. The arrangement provided startup funds for proper irrigation and soil amendments, plus a guaranteed purchase of the resulting harvest. But more importantly, it reconnected me to the scientific community I'd abandoned decades earlier. When I called Wren to share my excitement about this new venture, her response was predictably measured. "That sounds like a lot of work, Mom. Are you sure you're up for it? Maybe start with something smaller?" Finley was more direct. "Mom, you don't need to work. Dad's settlement was generous. Why put yourself through all that physical labor at your age?" Their concerns, though frustrating, were unsurprising. They had never known me as anything but Roland's wife and their mother. The ambitious researcher, the passionate botanist. These versions of me existed only in my own memory. Rather than argue, I simply proceeded with my plans. I hired local college students studying agriculture to help with the initial field preparation and planting. I converted part of the detached garage into a processing area for drying and storing the harvested plants. I took online courses in business management, absorbing information with the same intensity that had once made me a promising young scientist. The first harvest exceeded expectations. The lavender thrived in the microclimate of my property, producing essential oil with exceptionally high linalool content, particularly valuable for pharmaceutical applications. Eliza's Institute purchased the entire yield and immediately contracted for expanded production the following season. Encouraged by this success, I began experimenting with additional varieties and processing methods. Using my father's old formulas as starting points, I developed small batch salves and tinctures, testing them on my increasingly problematic gardener's hands. The results were remarkable. A calendula comfrey balm that healed cracked skin overnight, a lavender chamomile tincture that calmed inflammation. One of my student workers, Imara, was studying marketing along with sustainable agriculture. "Miss Caldwell, these products are amazing," she said after trying my hand balm. "You should be selling these." "That wasn't really the plan," I demurred, still thinking of my herb garden primarily as a research project rather than a business opportunity. "Can I show you something?" Imara asked, pulling out her laptop. She opened a presentation she'd prepared for a class project, a complete marketing strategy for what she called Meadowlark Botanicals, named after the birds that frequented my garden. The presentation was professional and compelling, identifying target markets, pricing strategies, and distribution channels. Most striking was how she had positioned the brand, not as simply natural or organic, but as scientifically formulated botanical solutions developed by a researcher with pharmaceutical training. People want natural products, but they also want ones that actually work, Imara explained. Your background gives these formulations credibility that most botanical brands can't claim. That night, I sat at my kitchen table once again at a crossroads. Expanding from research partner to business owner would require significant investment. Renovating the barn into a proper processing facility, obtaining necessary certifications, developing branded packaging, building an online presence. At 58, was I prepared to take such a risk? I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years, calling my younger brother, Miles. Unlike me, Miles had never followed the conventional path. He'd started and sold several businesses, traveled extensively, and maintained a refreshing disregard for societal expectations. "Nori," he said, using my childhood nickname when he answered my call. "Twice in 1 year. To what do I owe this honor?" I explained my situation, the research partnership, Imara's proposal, my hesitation about taking such a significant risk at my age. Miles laughed that infectious laugh that had always both irritated and delighted me. "Nori, when exactly did you start believing you were old?" he asked. "Was there a specific birthday when you decided your life was winding down rather than ramping up?" His question struck me like a physical blow. When had I internalized the idea that my productive years were behind me? Was it Roland's subtle messaging over decades? The youth-obsessed culture around us? My own acquiescence to diminished expectations? "The way I see it," Miles continued when I didn't immediately respond, "you've got at least 25 good years ahead. Maybe more, given how Dad lived to 92 sharp as a tack. So the question isn't whether you're too old to start something new. The question is, what do you want to do with those 25 years? That conversation became my North Star in moments of doubt over the years that followed. Whenever fear crept in, whenever the enormity of building a business from scratch seemed overwhelming, I would return to that essential question. What did I want to do with my remaining time? The answer, I discovered, was that I wanted to reclaim the path I'd abandoned, not just as a botanical researcher, but as someone who created tangible value in the world, someone whose work existed independently of her relationships to others, someone who could look in the mirror and recognize herself again. With newfound clarity, I took the settlement money Roland had provided, intended to maintain me in comfortable dependency, and invested it in myself. I registered Meadowlark Botanicals as an official business, I hired an architect to redesign the barn into a production facility that would meet FDA standards for cosmetic manufacturing. I worked with a lawyer to patent my most promising formulations. Each step required learning new skills, navigating unfamiliar territory. There were mistakes and setbacks. The first production run of my lavender chamomile tincture developed discoloration due to improper bottling. The initial website crashed during a promotional launch. An early retail partner went bankrupt, owing thousands in unpaid invoices. But there were triumphs too. The first time I saw my products professionally packaged with the Meadowlark logo, a stylized bird in flight above a lavender sprig. In professional contexts, I had grown comfortable with my expertise and authority. But in personal relationships, particularly with my children, I still sometimes slipped into patterns of deference and accommodation that no longer fit who I'd become. Addressing these ingrained habits became my next challenge. When Finley called to help me with tax planning, suggesting strategies I'd already implemented years earlier, I gently corrected his assumptions rather than nodding along. When Wren expressed concern about my travel schedule for international business meetings, I thanked her for her consideration but maintained my plans. These small assertions of independence were met with varying degrees of adjustment from my children. Finley initially bristled, interpreting my self-sufficiency as rejection of his assistance. Wren adapted more quickly, gradually shifting from protective concern to collegial respect. The most profound change came at Finley's 40th birthday celebration. Gathered with extended family at an upscale restaurant, conversation inevitably turned to career accomplishments and challenges. In previous years, I would have remained largely silent during these discussions, offering only supportive comments about others' achievements. This time, when Roland's new wife Allegra asked what I'd been doing with myself since the divorce, I responded honestly. Building Meadowlark Botanicals from concept to international distribution, I said simply. We're finalizing our third patent application next month and launching in Scandinavian markets this fall. The table fell momentarily silent. Roland cleared his throat uncomfortably, but what surprised me most was Finley's response. Mom's products are exceptional, he said, directing his comments to the table at large. My firm's been looking at incorporating more sustainable suppliers, and Meadowlark's environmental protocols are industry-leading. He turned to me with genuine curiosity. Would you be open to consulting with our procurement team about implementing similar standards? That moment, being recognized for my professional knowledge by my son in a public setting, marked a subtle but significant shift in our family dynamics. For perhaps the first time, Finley saw me not just as his mother, but as someone with valuable expertise in her own right. The following months brought increasing alignment between my personal and professional identities. I began accepting speaking engagements at industry conferences, sharing Meadowlark's approaches to sustainable cultivation and ethical business practices. After decades of supporting Roland at corporate functions, I found myself at the center of professional networks where my knowledge and experience were the currency that mattered. Wren attended one of these conferences, slipping into the back of the hall during my presentation on integrating traditional botanical knowledge with modern extraction technologies. Watching her expression as the audience engaged with my ideas, asking thoughtful questions, noting key points, treating me with evident respect, I realized she was seeing dimensions of me she'd never witnessed before. You're really good at this, she commented afterward as we shared coffee in the hotel lobby. You seem so authoritative. I've always been knowledgeable about plants, I reminded her gently. That didn't start with Meadowlark. She nodded slowly. I know that intellectually, but I think I only ever saw glimpses of that side of you growing up. Around Dad, you were different, more hesitant. Her observation was accurate, but incomplete. It wasn't just around your father, I clarified. It was the role I thought I needed to play in our family. The supportive wife, the nurturing mother. Those aspects were real too, but they weren't the entirety of who I am. Wren considered this, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. I'm trying to imagine what you might have become if you hadn't put your career aside when you married Dad. The question held no recrimination, just genuine curiosity. I'd probably have continued in research, I admitted. Perhaps developed pharmaceutical applications for traditional botanical remedies. Not so different from what I'm doing now, just through a different path. Do you regret it? She asked, her expression suddenly vulnerable. The years you spent focused on us instead of your career? The question deserved careful consideration. Did I regret the choices that had shaped my life's trajectory? The delayed fulfillment of my professional potential? The years spent subordinating my ambitions to others' expectations? I regret accepting the false choice between family and personal fulfillment, I answered finally. I regret believing that maternal devotion required professional surrender, but I never regret the time invested in you and Finley. I just wish I'd shown you a more complete version of myself along the way. As Meadowlark approached its 7th anniversary, the business faced its most significant opportunity yet. Lumina, a global wellness conglomerate, approached with an acquisition offer that exceeded all previous valuations. Their proposal included maintaining the existing management team, preserving our benefit corporation status, and investing substantially in our research division. The decision wasn't straightforward. Selling would provide financial security beyond anything I'd imagined possible when starting the business. It would allow me to step back from day-to-day operations while ensuring Meadowlark's continued growth. Yet I hesitated, uncertain whether the company's core values could truly be maintained within a larger corporate structure. Rather than making this decision alone, I convened a meeting of key stakeholders, my executive team, including Imara, representatives from our sustainable farming partners, and somewhat unexpectedly, Wren, whose legal expertise in corporate structuring had proved increasingly valuable to Meadowlark. The offer is exceptional from a financial perspective, Wren acknowledged after reviewing the terms. But I'm concerned about the governance provisions. Even with the benefit corporation protections, Lumina would have significant influence over strategic direction. Imara nodded in agreement. Our brand identity is intimately tied to our independence and authenticity. Being absorbed into a conglomerate, however well-intentioned, risks undermining that. The discussion continued for hours, weighing various perspectives and exploring alternative approaches. Eventually, a different path emerged, one I hadn't previously considered. What if, Wren suggested, instead of selling to Lumina, we restructured? As a privately held company with an employee ownership component, we could create a trust to maintain controlling interest, ensuring the company's mission remains protected while allowing employees to build equity. This approach resonated deeply. It would preserve Meadowlark's independence while creating mechanisms for continuity beyond my personal involvement. It recognized the contributions of the team that had helped build the company while formalizing our commitment to the values that had guided its development. Implementing this restructuring required months of legal work and financial modeling. Throughout the process, I found myself increasingly relying on Wren's expertise. Our professional collaboration deepened our personal relationship in unexpected ways, establishing a new dimension of mutual respect and understanding. During one late-night session finalizing the employee ownership documents, Wren looked up from her laptop with an expression of sudden insight. You know what I just realized? This is the first time in my life I've actually worked with you. Not as your daughter, but as a professional colleague. The observation captured something essential about our evolving relationship. Does that feel strange? I asked. Not strange, she considered. Illuminating. I'm seeing aspects of you I never knew existed. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Growing up, I always thought of you primarily in relation to us. To me, Finley, and Dad. Your identity seemed derivative somehow. Which sounds terrible now that I say it aloud. It's not terrible, I assured her. It's how children naturally perceive their parents. And to be fair, I presented myself that way for many years. But you were always this person too, she said, gesturing to the business documentation spread across the table. The strategist, the innovator, the botanical expert. I just never saw it clearly. Her recognition, so long in coming yet so meaningful in its arrival, felt like the closing of a circle. The daughter who had once pitied my perceived limitations now acknowledged the fullness of who I was and always had been. The restructuring was finalized on Meadowlark's 7th anniversary. Rather than the quiet celebration I'd initially planned, we organized an event that brought together everyone who had contributed to the company's success: employees, farming partners, research collaborators, and family members. Standing before this assembled community, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Meadowlark began as an act of reclamation, I told them, a way of reconnecting with parts of myself that had been set aside for too long. What started as personal healing has grown into something that creates value for all of us: sustainable livelihoods, ethical products, and hopefully, a model for how business can honor both people and planet. As I concluded my remarks and raised a glass in toast, my gaze found Wren and Finley standing together near the back of the room. Their expressions held something I'd spent decades without fully realizing I needed. Not just love or pride, but genuine recognition of who I was in my totality. The celebration continued well into the evening. As guests began to depart, Roland unexpectedly appeared, Allegra conspicuously absent. He approached somewhat hesitantly, surveying the transformed barn with its elegant botanical displays and sophisticated production facilities. "Nora," he began, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain, "I wanted to congratulate you. What you've built here is truly remarkable." "Thank you," I replied simply, neither seeking nor requiring his validation, but accepting it nonetheless. He hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about what you said, about how Meadowlark wouldn't have existed if we'd stayed together, about how you wouldn't have discovered this part of yourself." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I wonder," he said quietly, "how many parts of myself I might have discovered if I'd been brave enough to look beyond the narrow definition of success I was pursuing." The admission, vulnerable in a way Roland rarely allowed himself to be, caught me off guard. For a brief moment, I glimpsed the young man I'd fallen in love with decades earlier, before ambition and convention had calcified his perspective. "It's never too late to ask different questions of yourself," I offered, neither accusatory nor comforting, simply stating what I'd learned through experience. He nodded, a wistful expression crossing his features. "Perhaps, though some realizations come with the weight of what might have been." He straightened, composure returning. "In any case, I wanted you to know I recognize what you've accomplished here. It's extraordinary." As he turned to leave, I felt no triumph or vindication, only a quiet acknowledgement that our shared history had shaped both of us in ways neither could have anticipated. The pain of his betrayal had ultimately catalyzed my transformation, just as my success now prompted his reflection. That evening, after all the guests had departed, I walked alone through the gardens that had become Meadowlark's living laboratory. The summer air was heavy with the scent of lavender and mint. Twilight softened the landscape, blurring the boundaries between cultivated beds and wild meadow beyond. Standing among plants that had accompanied humanity's journey for thousands of years, healing, nourishing, connecting us to Earth's cycles, I felt a profound sense of place and purpose. At 63, I had finally found my way back to the path I'd once abandoned, though by routes I could never have predicted. The restructuring of Meadowlark Botanicals marked a turning point, not just for the business, but for my sense of personal legacy. With the employee ownership trust in place and daily operations running smoothly under our executive team's guidance, I found myself with something I hadn't experienced in decades: space to contemplate what might come next. At 64, I wasn't remotely interested in traditional retirement, but I did feel a growing desire to focus on aspects of botanical research that had been necessarily sidelined during Meadowlark's rapid growth phase. One crisp autumn morning, I sat with Imara in my office reviewing quarterly projections. The windows were open, carrying the earthy scent of the harvest season across my desk. Sales had exceeded expectations for the third consecutive quarter. Our Scandinavian expansion was proceeding smoothly, and employee retention remained remarkably high compared to industry standards. "We've established a solid foundation," Imara observed, closing her laptop with a satisfied smile. "The systems you've put in place are working beautifully." "We've established," I corrected gently. What had begun as occasional legal consultation evolved into regular strategic contributions. She maintained her independent law practice, but increasingly focused on clients in the sustainable business sector, often referring to principles she'd observed at Meadowlark. "Your benefit corporation structure has become something of a model case," she informed me during one of our now regular lunch meetings. "I've had 3 clients this month specifically request similar governance approaches. These parallel evolutions in my children's professional lives brought me quiet satisfaction. Without directly imposing my values, I had demonstrated an alternative to the consumption-focused business paradigm they'd absorbed from their father. They were finding their own ways to integrate purpose with profession, ethics with enterprise." The Foundation's first major research initiative launched 18 months after that initial board presentation. Working in partnership with 5 indigenous communities across 3 continents, we began systematically documenting traditional botanical preparations while analyzing their chemical compositions and potential applications. Elena assembled a diverse research team that included ethnobotanists, biochemists, and most importantly, traditional knowledge keepers from each partner community. These elders weren't treated as research subjects, but as expert collaborators whose insights guided our scientific inquiries. Our first significant finding came from a collaborative investigation with Marisol's community in Peru. They had traditionally used a particular preparation of Minthostachys mollis, known locally as munya, to treat respiratory infections. Our analysis revealed a unique combination of compounds with potent antimicrobial properties against pathogens that had developed resistance to conventional antibiotics. More importantly, the traditional preparation method, which involved a complex fermentation process, produced effects that couldn't be replicated through simple extraction of the plant's essential oils. This vindicated Marisol's insistence that the preparation process was as important as the plant material itself, something often overlooked in conventional pharmacological research that focused on isolating single, active ingredients. Publishing these findings in a respected scientific journal represented a delicate balancing act. We needed to validate the community's knowledge within established scientific frameworks while ensuring they received appropriate recognition and protection for their intellectual contributions. The solution involved listing Marisol and other community knowledge holders as primary authors alongside our scientific team, establishing a new precedent for acknowledging indigenous expertise in academic contexts. The publication generated significant interest from both scientific and traditional medicine communities. Invitations for presentations and collaboration requests arrived weekly. This attention brought new considerations about how to manage growing interest without overwhelming our partner communities or compromising our ethical commitments. During this period of rapid development, I received an unexpected invitation from Valmont University, my alma mater, where I'd completed my original botany degree nearly 4 decades earlier. They were organizing a symposium on integrative approaches to healthcare and wanted me to deliver the keynote address. Standing at the podium in the university's grand hall was a surreal experience. The last time I'd been in this building had been for my graduation, Full of ambition and scientific curiosity before marriage and motherhood had redirected my path. Now, I returned not as the student I had been, or the conventional success I had once envisioned becoming, but as something altogether different. A scientist entrepreneur whose unconventional journey had ultimately created distinctive contributions to both business and botanical research. My address focused on bridging traditional wisdom with contemporary science, emphasizing the urgent need to preserve botanical knowledge that was rapidly disappearing worldwide. I spoke of the false dichotomy between traditional and modern approaches, arguing instead for integrated methodologies that respected diverse knowledge systems while maintaining rigorous standards of evidence. As I concluded my remarks, I noticed Roland sitting in the audience, an unexpected presence that momentarily threw me off balance. We had maintained cordial if distant relations since our divorce, but his attendance at this professional event was unprecedented. More surprising still was seeing him seated beside Wren and Finley, who had apparently come without informing me. During the reception that followed, Roland approached with uncharacteristic hesitancy. "That was quite illuminating," he offered, maintaining the formal politeness that had characterized our post-divorce interactions. I had no idea the Foundation's work had advanced so substantially. "Thank you for coming," I replied, genuinely curious about his presence. "It's an unexpected pleasure." He glanced toward Wren and Finley, who were engaged in animated conversation with Elena across the room. "The children thought I should see this aspect of your work. They felt I might not fully appreciate what you've accomplished." The admission that our children had advocated for my achievements to their father filled me with a complex emotion I couldn't immediately identify. Not validation, exactly, but a sense of wholeness, as if fragmented pieces of my life were finally being recognized as part of a coherent whole. "And do you?" I asked, more directly than I might have in years past. "Appreciate it, that is?" Roland considered the question with unusual thoughtfulness. "I'm beginning to understand that I never really knew you, Nora. Or perhaps more accurately, I never allowed myself to know the entirety of who you were." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "That was my loss, as it turns out." The acknowledgement was as close to an apology as Roland had ever offered for the limitations he'd imposed during our marriage. Coming from someone constitutionally averse to admitting error, it represented significant personal growth. I accepted it as such, neither minimizing its importance nor over-investing it with meaning it didn't possess. We all had different futures available to us than the ones we initially imagined, I replied finally. "I'm grateful to have found mine, even if the path was circuitous." As Roland moved away to greet an acquaintance, Wren appeared at my side. "That looked intense," she observed. "Are you okay?" "More than okay," I assured her. "Just processing the strangeness of having all these separate parts of my life in one room." She nodded, understanding. "That's why we wanted Dad to come. He's only ever seen fragments of who you are. We thought he should witness the whole." Her deliberate effort to ensure I was seen completely, not just as his ex-wife or her mother, but as the accomplished professional in my own right, touched me deeply. It reflected how thoroughly our relationship had evolved from her earlier perception of me as someone needing protection to recognition of my full capabilities. The symposium concluded with unexpected recognition. The university announced the establishment of the Nora Caldwell Fellowship for Integrative Botanical Research. Funded by an anonymous donor, the fellowship would support graduate students pursuing cross-disciplinary research at the intersection of traditional botanical knowledge and contemporary science. I later learned the anonymous donor was actually a consortium led by Wren and Finley, who had organized contributions from various supporters, including, surprisingly, Roland himself. This collaboration between all the significant people from my personal history to advance my professional legacy felt like the closing of an important circle. As the Foundation's work expanded, I found myself increasingly focused on educational, initiatives that would ensure botanical knowledge transmission to future generations. We developed curricula that brought traditional knowledge keepers into classroom settings, created hands-on learning programs that taught sustainable harvesting practices, and established scholarship programs for Indigenous students pursuing scientific education. These efforts reflected my growing awareness that preservation alone was insufficient. For traditional botanical wisdom to remain vital, it needed active practitioners who could adapt ancient knowledge to contemporary contexts while maintaining its essential integrity. Working with young people, both from Indigenous communities and conventional educational backgrounds, became an unexpected source of personal renewal. Their questions challenged my assumptions. Their technological fluency complemented my experiential knowledge, and their enthusiasm reminded me daily of why this work mattered. Zuri, a particularly promising researcher who had joined us from the Rhodes Botanical Institute, captured this intergenerational exchange perfectly during a field expedition to Madagascar. As we worked alongside local healers documenting preparation, methods for a complex analgesic formulation, she observed, "This is the true meaning of sustainable. Knowledge that sustains itself across generations by remaining both relevant and reverent." Meadowlark has never been a solo endeavor, even if it began that way. She acknowledged this with a nod, then fixed me with that perceptive gaze that had made her such an effective marketing strategist. "You're thinking about stepping back, aren't you?" "Not stepping back," I clarified. "Stepping sideways. There's research I've wanted to pursue for years, traditional formulations with potential applications beyond cosmetics and wellness. With the company stable, it feels like the right time to explore those possibilities." What I didn't articulate fully, even to Imara, was the persistent feeling that my work with Meadowlark remained somehow incomplete. We had created exceptional products, built a thriving business with strong ethical foundations, and established new standards for sustainability in our industry. Yet something essential still called to me, the original scientific curiosity that had driven my earliest studies in botanical medicine. The seed of this new direction had been planted months earlier during a conversation with Dr. Elena Morales, a renowned ethnobotanist who had consulted on several of Meadowlark's formulations. Over dinner following an industry conference, Elena had shared stories of her recent fieldwork in the high mountain villages of Peru. "These communities have been using botanical preparations for centuries," she explained, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "What fascinates me is how precisely their traditional applications align with what we're now discovering about specific plant compounds through modern analytical methods." "The original researchers," I commented, thinking of my father's dog-eared notebooks filled with careful observations of plant effects. Elena nodded. "Exactly. But this knowledge is disappearing rapidly as younger generations move to urban areas, and traditional healers pass away without transmitting their expertise. There's an urgent need to document these practices before they're lost entirely." Something in her words resonated deeply with me, connecting to both my scientific background and my personal journey of reclamation. How many other forms of wisdom were being lost because they existed outside conventional channels of valuation? How many potential healing modalities remained unexplored because they originated from traditions deemed irrelevant in our hyper-medicalized approach to health? These questions lingered in my mind, gradually coalescing into the outline of a new project, one that would honor traditional botanical knowledge while subjecting it to rigorous scientific evaluation. Not to commodify these traditions, but to validate and preserve them on their own terms while potentially making their benefits more widely accessible. 3 weeks after my conversation with Amara, I presented a proposal to Meadowlark's board of directors. The Botanical Heritage Initiative, I called it, a research foundation that would partner with Indigenous communities to document traditional plant knowledge, conduct scientific analyses of botanical preparations, and develop educational resources to ensure these practices weren't lost to history. The foundation would operate as a nonprofit affiliate of Meadowlark, I explained, displaying slides that outlined governance structures, funding mechanisms, and research protocols. Initial funding would come from a dedicated percentage of company profits, with additional support from grants and charitable contributions. The board's response was overwhelmingly positive, though not without practical questions about implementation. Wren, who now served as one of our independent directors, raised her hand with characteristic directness. "The mission is compelling," she acknowledged, "but establishing meaningful partnerships with indigenous communities requires specialized expertise and deep relationship building. Have you considered who would lead this work?" It was a valid question that cut to the heart of the initiative's potential limitations. "I've been in preliminary discussions with Dr. Elena Morales about serving as the Foundation's research director," I replied. "Her established relationships with several communities would provide an ethical entry point. But you're right that this work requires cultural competencies beyond my personal experience." What followed was a thoughtful discussion about how to ensure the initiative genuinely served the communities whose knowledge it sought to preserve, rather than extracting value from them. We established core principles that would guide all partnerships: community leadership in determining research priorities, equitable sharing of any financial benefits generated, recognition of intellectual property rights, and absolute respect for knowledge that communities deemed sacred or not appropriate for wider dissemination. As the meeting concluded, I felt a familiar spark of excitement, the same energy that had propelled me through Meadowlark's early development. This new direction wasn't a departure from what we'd built, but rather an expansion of its fundamental values into realms beyond commercial enterprise. The following months were consumed with establishing the Foundation's legal structure, developing detailed research protocols, and building relationships with potential partner communities. I traveled extensively with Elena, visiting traditional healers in mountainous regions of Peru and Ecuador, remote villages in Madagascar, and indigenous communities in northern Australia. These journeys challenged me physically and culturally, pushing me far beyond the comfortable routines I'd established at Meadowlark. At 64, I found myself hiking mountain trails to reach isolated communities, sleeping in basic accommodations, without modern amenities, and communicating through translators when direct language connection wasn't possible. Yet these challenges were accompanied by moments of profound connection and learning. In a small Quechua community in the Peruvian highlands, I spent 3 days with Marisol, an elderly healer who had been preserving her family's botanical traditions since childhood. She showed me how she harvested specific plants only during certain lunar phases, prepared infusions using precise temperature gradients, and applied different formulations based on subtle variations in symptoms that Western medicine often lumped into single diagnostic categories. "Plant speak," Shitar told me through our translator, her weathered hands expertly stripping leaves from a woody stem. "Not with words, but with energy. You must listen with more than ears." Her statement might once have seemed mystical to my scientifically trained mind, but after years working intimately with botanical materials, I recognized the truth in her perspective. Different harvest times, growing conditions, and processing methods profoundly affected plant properties in ways that could be verified through chemical analysis, but were most immediately apparent through direct sensory engagement. These experiences reinforced my conviction about the Foundation's importance, while humbling me regarding my own knowledge limitations. I was a scientist with decades of botanical experience, yet these traditional practitioners understood plant relationships and applications that had never appeared in my formal education. As the Foundation took shape, an unexpected parallel development emerged in my personal life. Finley, who had initially been the more resistant of my children to my transformation, approached me about a personal project. "I've been thinking about sustainable land management," he explained during a weekend visit to my home. "My firm has been acquiring properties for development, but I've been uncomfortable with our approach to the existing ecosystems. I was wondering if you might consult with me on more regenerative alternatives." His request represented a significant shift in our relationship dynamic. For the first time, he was seeking my expertise not out of politeness, but genuine professional respect. We spent that afternoon walking the grounds of Meadowlark, discussing how our cultivation practices preserved biodiversity while maximizing yield through companion planting and careful resource management. "You've created an entirely different model here," he observed, surveying the carefully designed growing zones that mimicked natural plant communities rather than imposing artificial monocultures. "It's beautiful and productive." "The beauty and productivity aren't separate qualities," I explained. "They're interconnected expressions of ecological health. When systems function as integrated wholes rather than isolated components, both aesthetic harmony and practical efficiency emerge naturally." Something in this perspective clearly resonated with him. In the months that followed, he began incorporating similar principles into his development projects, preserving existing green spaces and designing buildings that worked with natural landscapes rather than imposing upon them. His professional trajectory gradually shifted toward environmentally conscious development, not abandoning his core expertise, but redirecting it toward more harmonious applications. This evolution in Finley's approach mirrored my own journey, from conventional science to a more integrated understanding of botanical wisdom. We were both learning to honor traditional knowledge while applying it to contemporary challenges. He in the built environment, I in healthcare and wellness. Our shared interest created new dimensions in our relationship, allowing us to connect beyond familiar family patterns. When he invited me to consult on a major redevelopment project for an aging industrial zone, I recognized it as more than a professional courtesy. It was an acknowledgement of our mutual growth and a desire to collaborate as equals. Meanwhile, Wren's involvement with Meadowlark continued to deepen. Her insight crystallized something I had been feeling but hadn't articulated: that sustainability wasn't merely about environmental resources, but about cultural resources as well. Traditional knowledge systems that had developed over centuries contained sophisticated understandings of plant-human relationships that couldn't be replicated through isolated laboratory studies, no matter how technologically advanced. This recognition guided the Foundation's approach to scientific validation. Rather than attempting to reduce traditional preparations to isolated compounds that could be synthesized commercially, we focused on understanding how complex botanical interactions achieved therapeutic effects. This sometimes meant accepting that certain preparations defied complete scientific explanation, given current analytical limitations, an intellectual humility that wasn't always comfortable for conventionally trained researchers, but that honored the empirical validity of traditional observations. Our methodological innovations gradually gained recognition within scientific communities previously skeptical of traditional medicine. Invitations to present at pharmacological conferences, collaborations with major research universities, and funding from prestigious scientific institutions affirmed that we were successfully building bridges between knowledge systems. This professional recognition coincided with a personal milestone: my 65th birthday. Unlike my 60th, which had passed with minimal acknowledgement during Meadowlark's early development phase, this occasion became an opportunity for celebration that reflected my transformed circumstances. Wren and Finley organized a gathering that brought together people from all domains of my life: Meadowlark employees, Foundation researchers, academic colleagues, and family members. The venue was the botanical gardens where I'd taken refuge during the painful early days after Roland's departure, a location that symbolized both my lowest point and the beginning of my renewal. The evening featured thoughtful tributes that acknowledged different facets of my journey. Elena spoke about our research collaboration, Imara reflected on Meadowlark's development, and Miles shared stories from our childhood that highlighted the persistent curiosity that had eventually found expression in my second-act career. Most moving were the words from my children. Finley, never naturally comfortable with public speaking, nevertheless stood before the assembled guests with evident emotion. "The woman standing before you today," Finley began, his voice steadier than I'd anticipated, is someone I've been privileged to discover gradually over these past several years. Growing up, I knew her as simply Mom, the person who made our lunches, attended our school events, and kept our lives running smoothly. It took me embarrassingly long to recognize that this was merely one dimension of a multifaceted individual with depths I hadn't bothered to explore. He paused, meeting my gaze across the room with uncharacteristic openness. When Mom revealed Meadowlark Botanicals to us, my first reaction wasn't pride or admiration. It was disbelief, followed by something uncomfortably close to resentment. I couldn't reconcile this accomplished entrepreneur with the mother I thought needed my protection. That failure of imagination was mine, not hers. His words captured precisely the journey our relationship had taken, from his well-intentioned but condescending concern to genuine respect. More importantly, they acknowledged his own growth alongside mine. Wren followed with reflections that touched on similar themes from her perspective. Mom never asked us to see her completely, she observed. She simply continued becoming more fully herself until the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. That patient self-reclamation has taught me more about genuine strength than any conventional success story ever could. As the evening progressed, I found myself contemplating how thoroughly my life had transformed since that devastating afternoon when Roland announced his departure. What had initially felt like an ending had ultimately opened pathways to fulfillment I couldn't have imagined within the constraints of my former existence. The days following my birthday celebration brought a flurry of activity as the foundation prepared for its most ambitious project yet, an international conference bringing together traditional healers, scientific researchers, and policy advocates, focused on preserving botanical knowledge. Scheduled for the following spring in Valmont Heights, the gathering would feature presentations in multiple languages, hands-on workshops led by Indigenous practitioners, and scientific panels exploring methodologies for ethical research collaboration. Planning such a complex event while maintaining our ongoing research initiatives stretched our team's capacity. I found myself working longer hours than I had in months, often staying at the office well into the evening reviewing presentation, proposals, and coordinating with international participants. The work was intellectually engaging but physically demanding, particularly given the extensive travel required to meet with potential presenters who couldn't be reached through conventional communication channels. On a particularly grueling day that had begun with pre-dawn video calls to Australia and would end with late-night discussions with Peruvian partners, I noticed Imara watching me with concern as I massaged my temples against a building headache. "You know," she observed carefully, "the Foundation has sufficient staff now to handle most of this coordination without your direct involvement in every detail." I smiled ruefully. "Old habits. I've never been particularly skilled at delegation." "It's not just about delegation," she countered. "It's about sustainable leadership. You've built Meadowlark on principles of ecological sustainability, systems that renew themselves rather than depleting their resources. Shouldn't your personal work patterns reflect the same philosophy?" Her gentle challenge echoed questions I'd been quietly asking myself. At 65, I remained vibrantly engaged with my work, but the physical limitations of aging were undeniable. Recovering from travel took longer, sustained concentration required more effort, and my energy reserves didn't replenish as quickly as they once had. Yet acknowledging these realities felt dangerously close to accepting the diminished capacity my children had once projected onto me. I had fought so hard against being sidelined due to age that I sometimes pushed beyond reasonable limits to prove my continued vitality. "I'm still perfectly capable of managing this workload," I replied, more defensively than I'd intended. Imara nodded. "Unquestionably, but capability isn't the relevant metric here. The question is whether constantly operating at maximum capacity serves your ultimate objectives. Ecological systems function optimally with breathing room, periods of intensity balanced with restoration. Why would human systems be any different?" Her framing shifted my perspective. This wasn't about capability, but sustainability. Not just of my personal energy, but of the Foundation's work over the long term. If our mission truly mattered, then ensuring its continuation beyond my direct involvement was essential. That meant developing leadership capacity in others and creating organizational structures that didn't depend exclusively on my participation. This realization prompted me to initiate a series of changes in my work approach. I began more systematically mentoring promising team members, explicitly sharing not just tasks, but the decision-making processes behind them. I established clearer boundaries around my availability, designating specific days for focused research work without administrative interruptions. Most significantly, I began preparing Elena to eventually assume primary leadership of the Foundation, recognizing that her combination of scientific expertise and relationship skills with traditional communities made her the natural successor. These adjustments didn't diminish my engagement but rather refined it, allowing me to focus more intentionally on aspects of our work where my specific contributions added greatest value. The distributed leadership model we developed ultimately strengthened the organization, creating resilience through diverse perspectives and complementary skills. As the conference date approached, our careful preparation was disrupted by unexpected news that threatened the entire project. The International Pharmaceutical Trade Association announced plans to lobby for regulatory changes that would severely restrict research on botanical compounds without formal pharmaceutical sponsorship. If implemented, these regulations would effectively prevent many of our community-based research partnerships from continuing. The timing wasn't coincidental. Our Foundation's work had begun generating significant attention from both scientific and public health communities, challenging conventional pharmaceutical monopolies on therapeutic development. Several major companies had attempted to acquire exclusive rights to formulations we'd documented, offering substantial payments to partner communities in exchange for proprietary access. When these offers were declined in favor of our open-source, community-controlled approach, industry leaders apparently decided on more aggressive tactics. Addressing this existential threat required pivoting resources away from conference planning toward urgent policy advocacy. Wren's legal expertise proved invaluable as we developed responses to the proposed regulations, identifying jurisdictional vulnerabilities and crafting counter-proposals that would protect traditional knowledge while maintaining scientific rigor. The situation became increasingly complex when media outlets began reporting on the controversy. As the Foundation's public face, I found myself thrust into an advocacy role I hadn't anticipated, giving interviews, testifying before regulatory committees, and mobilizing support from allied organizations. The spotlight brought both opportunities and challenges, including renewed attention to my personal journey from corporate wife to scientific entrepreneur. A profile in Valmont Heights' major newspaper described me as an unlikely revolutionary, a grandmother who disrupted pharmaceutical research paradigms through sheer determination. The characterization, while technically accurate, reduced decades of scientific training and methodical business development to a simplistic narrative of plucky elderhood triumphing against expectations. More concerning were industry attempts to discredit our research as scientifically unsound and dangerously unregulated. Public relations firms hired by pharmaceutical interests suggested our Foundation was exploiting indigenous communities rather than empowering them, accusations that struck at the heart of our ethical commitments. Responding effectively required amplifying voices that weren't my own. Rather than defending our methods myself, I stepped back to create platforms where our partner communities and scientific collaborators could speak directly about their experiences. We organized public forums where traditional healers shared their knowledge alongside academically trained researchers, demonstrating through practice rather than rhetoric how different knowledge systems could productively inform each other. This approach gradually shifted public discourse from simplified narratives about individual actors, myself included, toward the substantive issues at stake: who controls healing knowledge, how diverse cultural wisdoms can be honored within scientific frameworks, and what responsibilities exist toward traditional knowledge keepers in an increasingly commercialized healthcare landscape. The regulatory battle continued for months, consuming significant foundation resources and repeatedly delaying our planned conference. Yet this challenge ultimately strengthened our work in unexpected ways, forcing us to articulate our methodologies with greater precision and building broader coalitions with like-minded organizations worldwide. By the time the International Botanical Medicine Conference finally convened, nearly a year after its originally scheduled date, it had evolved from a modest gathering into a watershed event for the field. Over 800 participants from 43 countries converged on Valmont Heights, representing traditions ranging from Ayurvedic medicine to indigenous North American practices to traditional Chinese medicine. Standing at the podium to deliver the opening address, I surveyed the extraordinary diversity of the assembled participants, elders in traditional dress, seated alongside researchers in business attire, university students exchanging notes with apprentice healers, government officials engaged in animated discussion with community advocates. This unprecedented convergence of knowledge systems represented exactly what our foundation had been working toward: genuine dialogue across boundaries that had historically been treated as impermeable. We gathered today not to romantically preserve traditions as museum artifacts, I began, nor to extractively mine traditional knowledge for commercial applications. Rather, we come together in recognition that healing wisdom belongs to humanity, collectively while originating in specific cultural contexts that deserve both respect and recompense. Our challenge is to honor these seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously. The conference proceedings reflected this balanced approach. Scientific panels required traditional knowledge keeper participation for validation. Workshop facilitators spoke multiple languages or worked with cultural translators to ensure concepts retained their integrity across linguistic boundaries. Business discussions included explicit consideration of equitable benefit sharing with source communities. Most significantly, the gathering established formal protocols for ethical botanical research that were subsequently adopted by scientific journals and funding organizations worldwide. These protocols, developed collaboratively during the conference, ensured that traditional knowledge contributions received proper attribution, that research benefits flowed back to source communities, and that indigenous practitioners maintained control over knowledge they considered sacred or not appropriate for commercialization. As the conference concluded, the Foundation announced the launch of a global database documenting thousands of traditional botanical preparations, along with their culturally appropriate applications and scientific analyses. Unlike proprietary pharmaceutical databases, this resource remained freely accessible to communities worldwide, while incorporating sophisticated cultural permission systems that respected indigenous protocols regarding knowledge dissemination. The database's unveiling marked a personal milestone as well. Though I would continue serving on the Foundation's board, I officially transferred executive leadership to Elena, completing the succession planning we had developed over the preceding year. The transition felt neither premature nor overdue, but appropriately timed, allowing me to step back from daily operational responsibilities while maintaining meaningful engagement with our research initiatives. This redefined relationship with the Foundation coincided with other life adjustments. After a decade maintaining my sprawling property to accommodate Meadowlark's research gardens, I decided to simplify my living arrangements. Not by moving to the assisted living facility my children had once envisioned, but by designing a more manageable home that better suited my current needs while maintaining connection to the land that had transformed my life. Working with Finley, whose architectural focus had increasingly shifted towards sustainable design, I planned a smaller residence adjacent to Meadowlark's research facilities. The design incorporated universal accessibility features that would accommodate potential mobility changes as I aged, while creating seamless connections between indoor and outdoor spaces that reflected my continued engagement with botanical cultivation. "This isn't downsizing," I explained when Wren expressed surprise at my decision. "It's right-sizing for this phase of life. The property will remain under the Meadowlark Trust, continuing to serve its research purpose, while my personal living space reflects current rather than historical requirements. The distinction was important to me. Unlike the assisted living facility my children had proposed years earlier, which would have separated me from meaningful work and productive engagement, this transition preserved my connection to purpose, while acknowledging changing physical needs. It wasn't capitulation to aging, but conscious adaptation that enhanced rather than diminished quality of life. Construction began that autumn, coinciding with my 67th birthday. The timing felt symbolically appropriate, breaking ground on new foundations exactly 7 years after Roland's departure had catalyzed my transformation. What had begun as unwanted disruption had evolved through multiple iterations, each building upon rather than replacing what came before. As the framework of my new home took shape, I found myself reflecting on the parallel constructions of my reconstituted identity, how I had similarly built new structures of selfhood upon foundations that remained fundamentally sound despite the seismic shifts of midlife abandonment. The architectural metaphor resonated deeply, reminding me that adaptation needn't mean erasure of what came before. This period of transition was marked by unexpected reconciliations in multiple domains. Roland, whose health had begun declining, following a minor stroke, reached out with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I've been thinking about mortality lately," he admitted during a rare phone call. "There are conversations we probably should have had years ago." Though wary of reopening. Old wounds. I agreed to meet him for coffee at a neutral location. The man who arrived appeared physically diminished compared to the commanding presence I remembered. Slightly stooped, movements careful, voice softer. Yet there was also a gentleness present that had been largely absent during our marriage. "I've spent a lot of time reflecting on our years together," he began after initial pleasantries. "Not always comfortably. I'm beginning to recognize how thoroughly I failed to see you, not just your potential, but who you actually were beneath the roles I expected you to fulfill." The acknowledgement, delivered without expectation of absolution, seemed to cost him considerable effort. This wasn't the practiced charm Roland had wielded throughout our marriage, but something rawer and more authentic, a genuine reckoning with his limitations. "We were both products of our time and circumstances," I offered, neither absolving nor condemning. I participated in my own diminishment by accepting boundaries I should have questioned. He shook his head slightly. "That's generous of you, but not entirely accurate. I actively discouraged your growth whenever it threatened my sense of position. I'm not proud of that man looking back." We talked for nearly 2 hours, the most honest conversation we'd had in decades of knowing each other. There were no dramatic revelations or tearful reconciliations, just quiet acknowledgement of how we had each contributed to a relationship dynamic that ultimately served neither of us well. As we prepared to leave, Roland hesitated, then asked simply, "Are you happy, Nora, with how your life has unfolded?" The question deserved careful consideration rather than reflexive reassurance. "I'm fulfilled," I answered finally. Which isn't quite the same as happy, but is perhaps more sustainable. My work matters, my relationships have depth, and I recognize myself in the life I've created. That feels like enough. He nodded slowly. "More than enough. It's everything, really." We parted with the tacit understanding that while the past couldn't be undone, it could be regarded with greater compassion for ourselves and each other than we had previously allowed. This wasn't forgiveness exactly, but a mutual recognition that our shared history, for all its limitations, had shaped both of us in ways that ultimately led to necessary growth. Similar recalibrations occurred in other relationships. Miles, whose health had deteriorated more rapidly than mine despite being the younger sibling, moved into a cottage on Meadowlark's property where I could more easily support him through increasingly frequent medical treatments. Our childhood bond, always characterized by competitive affection, deepened into something more nurturing as our respective vulnerabilities became more apparent. Even my long-strained relationship with Allegra, Roland's second wife, found unexpected resolution. Following his stroke, she approached me hesitantly about his care needs. "The doctors recommend regular cognitive exercises," she explained, clearly uncomfortable seeking my assistance. "They mentioned that engaging with significant memories can help rebuild neural pathways. You share 4 decades of history I know nothing about." Her request, to help Roland reconnect with formative experiences I had witnessed, might once have felt intrusive or manipulative. Now it simply seemed like appropriate collaboration in support of someone we had both, in different ways, shared life with. This period of reconciliations extended to my professional identity as well. Valmont University invited me to design a cross-disciplinary course on integrative botanical medicine, allowing me to formally synthesize scientific training with the traditional knowledge approaches I'd been exploring through the foundation. Teaching introduced an unexpected source of fulfillment, the opportunity to shape emerging scientists' understanding before they became entrenched in conventional methodological frameworks. "You're uniquely qualified to bridge these domains," the department chair explained when extending the invitation. "Students need guides who can navigate between different knowledge systems without privileging one at the expense of others." This educational role grew organically, eventually expanding to include mentorship of graduate researchers and guest lectures at institutions worldwide. I found particular satisfaction in working with students from indigenous backgrounds who were pursuing scientific training while maintaining connection to their cultural healing traditions. Their integration of different epistemological approaches often generated innovative research questions that conventional scientific training alone might never have surfaced. Throughout these transitions, Meadowlark Botanicals continued flourishing under new leadership. Imara assumed the CEO position, bringing fresh energy and technological sophistication while maintaining the ethical foundations we'd established. The employee ownership structure ensured that organizational values remained centered even as specific strategies evolved to address changing market conditions. I maintained meaningful connection with Meadowlark while relinquishing day-to-day involvement, attending quarterly board meetings, consulting on research initiatives that aligned with my expertise, and serving as an organizational elder whose historical perspective provided useful context without constraining innovation. This balanced engagement satisfied my need for continued purpose while creating space for successive generations of leadership to emerge. As my 71st birthday approached, I completed the move to my new home on Meadowlark's property. The timing coincided with several significant milestones. The Foundation's international database had documented over 5,000 traditional botanical preparations. Meadowlark's product line had expanded into medical-grade applications being used in hospital settings worldwide, and perhaps most meaningfully, Wren had recently announced her decision to join the Foundation's legal team full-time. "Corporate law paid well," she explained when sharing her career shift. "But I've realized I want my work to create different kinds of value. Seeing what you've built here has changed my understanding of what success can look like." Her choice reflected perhaps the most meaningful legacy of my unexpected journey, demonstrating through lived example rather than explicit instruction that conventional metrics of achievement could be questioned and alternative paths created at any life stage. That Wren had absorbed this lesson in her 40s rather than her 60s represented intergenerational progress I found deeply satisfying. The housewarming gathering in my new home brought together the diverse strands of my reconstituted life: Meadowlark colleagues, Foundation researchers, academic collaborators, and family members all mingling in spaces designed for connection, across differences. Finley had integrated elements from my original herb garden into the landscaping, preserving the specific varieties that had launched my botanical journey, while arranging them in more accessible configurations, appropriate to my changing physical capabilities. As twilight descended, I found myself seated on the porch with Miles, watching younger generations engage in animated conversation across the garden. Traditional healers from our partner communities taught university researchers improvise dance steps. Wren's teenage children displayed plants they had cultivated under their grandmother's guidance. Meadowlark employees discussed production innovations with foundation scientists, boundaries between commercial and research domains increasingly fluid. "You've created quite a legacy," Miles observed, gesturing toward the thriving community before us. Though I suspect legacy isn't quite the right word, since it implies something left behind rather than actively unfolding. His observation captured precisely what felt most meaningful about this phase of life. The various initiatives I'd helped establish weren't static monuments but dynamic, evolving entities with their own momentum and direction. They would continue developing in ways I couldn't predict and might not wholly approve. Expressions of collective imagination rather than individual vision. This recognition brought an unexpected sense of liberation. The compulsion to control outcomes that had characterized much of my adult life, manifesting differently but persistently across roles as mother, wife, and organizational founder, had gradually yielded to something more spacious. Not abdication of responsibility, but acceptance that influence and determination were different qualities entirely. As darkness settled over the garden and conversation continued by lantern light, I reflected on the circuitous path that had led to this moment of contentment. The painful rupture of Roland's departure, which had once seemed an ending, had ultimately created opening for authentic becoming. The children's well-intentioned attempt to manage my aging, which had triggered my revelation about Meadowlark, had catalyzed deeper mutual recognition across generational boundaries. Even my relationship with my own aging had transformed, from resistance against others' limiting perceptions to conscious navigation of changing capabilities. I had learned that acknowledging certain limitations didn't mean surrendering to diminishment, but rather focusing energy more precisely toward contributions of greatest value. The vibrant community gathered around me represented fulfillment beyond anything I could have imagined during those early days of post-divorce disorientation. Not because of material success or professional recognition, though both had eventually manifested, but because of the fundamental reclamation of selfhood their existence represented. I had recovered not just capability, but congruence. External expression finally aligned with internal knowing that had too long remained unexpressed. As guests gradually departed and quiet descended, I surveyed my new home with deep satisfaction. Unlike the house Roland and I had shared, designed primarily to project status and accommodate entertainment, this space reflected authentic preferences and priorities. Natural materials, abundant light, seamless transitions between indoor and outdoor environments, practical workspaces for continued botanical experimentation. Most importantly, it represented a choice made from self-knowledge rather than external expectation, a physical manifestation of the internal liberation I had gradually, painstakingly achieved. The journey from that devastating afternoon when Roland announced his departure to this peaceful evening in a home of my own creation had not been linear or entirely intentional. Progress had come through messy iteration, painful realizations, and unexpected opportunities recognized and seized. Yet standing here 7 years later, I couldn't wish for any different path. Each difficulty had ultimately led toward greater authenticity. Each misguided attempt by others to define my capabilities had strengthened my resolve to determine them for myself. Each relationship reconfiguration had created space for more genuine connection. The million-dollar business that had so shocked my children when revealed was ultimately not the most significant outcome of my transformation. It was merely tangible evidence of a more profound internal shift, from acceptance of others' definitions to insistence on self-determination. From reflexive accommodation to conscious choice. From fragments of identity contingent on external roles to integrated selfhood capable of meaningful contribution regardless of circumstance. As I prepared for sleep in my new bedroom, windows, Open to night breezes carrying the scent of herbs from gardens I had planted, doors secure in a home I had envisioned, mind content with purpose I had defined. I recognized the journey was far from complete. There would be further adaptations required as my body continued changing. Additional reconciliations with past choices and relationships. New expressions of purpose appropriate to each life phase. But the foundation had been established. Not the business bearing that name, but the internal structure of self-knowledge, purpose, and authentic connection that would sustain whatever transitions lay ahead. My children's well-intentioned intervention years earlier had inadvertently revealed the true measure of capability, not independence from all limitation, but conscious engagement with life's inherent constraints and possibilities. Their concern that I couldn't care for myself had catalyzed the revelation that I had created far more than they realized. But the deeper truth, understood fully only now, was that the million-dollar business had never been the most valuable thing I'd built. The capacity to recognize my own worth independent of others' assessments, that was the true achievement, the genuine liberation, the lasting legacy worth passing forward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.